Alrighty, welcome back to Incorrectly Political. Today we're going to be discussing the topic, should drugs be decriminalized? So today we're joined by Quinn and I, the host Ben. So Quinn today is going to be taking the position that drugs should be decriminalized, whereas I'm going to be taking the position that they shouldn't be decriminalized. So before we get into the topic, I just really want to quickly explain the difference between drugs being legalized and being decriminalized. So there is a key difference in that legalized means that you're fully allowed to do it and there's no repercussions behind it. You can have any quantity you want. You can use it in any way you want. Whereas decriminalized just means that there aren't serious legal penalties against it. And so if you only have a personal use amount, you won't face imprisonment for it, just as long as you have a personal use amount. Not if you have a large quantity, using it and shipping it. But that's basically an introduction to the topic. Quinn, do you have a few sentences to say about your position?
Yes, well, by decriminalization, just to clarify a little bit more, we mean that if you have less than a 10-day supply on you, there will be no penalty. But if you are a dealer, transporter, or anything like that, you will be punished. And I believe that yes, we should decriminalize all drugs, but we should take the money that we spend on punishing addicts and treating them as criminals, and we should use that money to rehabilitate addicts and connect them with society.
Okay, so let's get into our kind of first topic that we're going to be discussing about, and that's going to be enforcement on criminals, which in this scenario are going to be those that are distributing the drug. So decriminalization is going to be affecting them. Is it going to be cracking down on them more or more effectively reducing their damage to society?
Well, right now, the law enforcement agencies have to work on both catching dealers and users, so if drugs are decriminalized, they will be able to focus on only dealers, which I think would make them more effective at being able to catch and punish the dealers.
Okay. On the other side, I think it's going to be tougher because I think it's going to grow the power of these drug dealers and organizations that distribute drugs, because I think there's going to be much more customers available, which we'll later discuss. I think there's going to be more customers available, which will mean more business, and in return, more power for these drug organizations. Let's move on to kind of the bigger topic here, which just kind of segues into is impact on addicts. How is this going to affect the people, kind of the victims of this scenario, are using these drugs, I think it's a big point of contention.
Well, I think that decriminalizing drugs will definitely help addicts, as it'll take down some of the barriers that prevent them from getting help. I read an article from Time magazine about how Portugal has decriminalized their drugs. They discussed how it was made easier for addicts to seek help. And to quote the article, between 1998 and 2011, the number of people in drug treatment increased by over 60%. And that's because it eliminates the threat of criminal penalties, along with it eliminates a great deal of stigma.
Mm-hmm. I think on the other hand, you can look at news sources from NPR that I think the key here anyway is that we want addicts to get into recovery, right? We want them to fix and transform their lives around. On my hand, I think using the evidence that we have from sources such as NPR show that recidivism rates, which are basically the chance that the person reoffends and in this case scenario will be using drugs again after being caught using them, are pretty much equal even after decriminalization. And so I think that this stop in penalizing people for using them really won't help them change. For example, in Oregon, they only have a $100 fine that really isn't enforced. So I think it just gives people an easier way to use these drugs since there is no repercussions for using them. It's kind of like an easier path to addiction that prevents them from getting out, at least from my perspective. So moving on to our next part of this, how effective will this decriminalization be, and how can we draw from examples to evaluate that?
Yeah, looking at Portugal is a great example of how effective this can be. In the year 2000, they had the worst drug problem in all of Europe. 1% of their total population was addicted to heroin. The officials didn't really see a way out. They kept trying the method that we have in most countries, such as the US, which is punishing everyone involved. So they decided to try a different approach. they got together a team of experts and they asked them to come up with a new solution. And the new solution the experts came up with was to decriminalize all drugs and use their resources to help addicts. In 2015, the British Journal of Criminology looked back on how successful it was, and drug use was down by over 50%, overdose rates were way down, and HIV rates were also down. A reason for this is that they did not only decriminalize the drugs, but they also funded programs to help the addicts. They even have people where it is their job to go around and give addicts fresh needles and other sterile products to help them basically use drugs, but it would make it so they could do it more safely. And the workers would come back every single day, and they offer not only to give the addicts drug use items, but they also offer to give the addicts rehabilitation programs where the addicts are given a way back into society, such as a job. This work has made it so it is safer for the addicts to use drugs, so they're not overdosing, they're not getting HIV, and they have a way back into normal life.
So when we look at the examples of countries such as Netherlands or a city such as Zurich, I think what we can see is Netherlands, which has a really liberal policy on drugs. There's actually drug tourists, as they're called, which actually come to Netherlands just using drugs, and it's actually really ravaged a lot of what the intention of decriminalization was. I think, for example, you see in both Zurich and then in the Netherlands in general, you see a large resurgence in drug usages and rates. And I think while originally the idea of decriminalization was still meant to be attacking addicts who use it privately, it's actually become a very widespread public problem as addicts begin to use it in public places because they have no repercussions for using it. And I think this use of dirty needles actually going into public places as well as drug residue is extremely dangerous for the public, and it can impact people other than these addicts. And my last example would be Oregon, where, as I kind of touched on earlier, Oregon, which had one of the highest drug rates in the U.S., continues to struggle even though they have decriminalized drugs. In fact, as I said earlier, their reoffense rates are still just as high as they were before decriminalization. And so when you look at Oregon, which is a much more comparable model to if we were to decriminalize drugs in the U.S. compared to Portugal, I think the evidence tends to support not going the decriminalization route.
I would like to ask, though, did Oregon go quite as far as Portugal did, as to have people checking in on the addicts every single day, offering to help them? Because I think that Portugal's visiting of addicts in their cities every single day, it really made it so public drug use wasn't as much of a problem.
No, I don't think that it did, and I think this is because of the problem of implementation, leading into the final subject that we're going to be discussing, which is implementation. So my take on implementation is, obviously Portugal has been a very pro-decriminalization example this entire conversation, but I think what we need to realize is that Portugal is a single country of approximately 10 million people, and they have a completely centralized government. They don't have separate states, whereas and it took them approximately 2 years to transition into hiring addiction specialists, doctors, and social workers to support these addicts from their original system of incarceration. And so I think if we try and compare this model to the United States, if it took over 2 years for Portugal to transfer necessary resources to their health system, just look at a country of the U.S., which not only has a population 35 times that, but also we have this problem of 50 different states that have their own states' rights on this issue, which would, even if we federally decriminalize drugs, it would still be a large issue with states in terms of them trying to do what they want to do with these policies and whether they want to enforce them. Now, I think that really what we're doing here is we're just transferring these addicts and their struggles from the prison system into the health system. And I think if we had better methods to already support it with the health system, instead of just trying to redistribute this money and cause a major overhaul in our budgeting, it would be a much easier solution.
Yeah, implementation in the United States would be quite a bit harder. But before I get to that, I would like to say you mentioned one of the big things that I would like to talk about at the end there. You said they would transfer the addicts from the prison system to the health system. This is actually the entire point of decriminalization because addiction is not a criminal issue, it's a health issue. In the criminal system, the addicts get punished for their addiction, which often makes their addiction worse, and in the health system, they're helped to end their addiction. If we are able to lower the number of addicts, that would mean that there is a lower amount of drug use, which would solve many problems. Now, for implementation in the US, I do not really have a good system for implementation here. The US is such a large and diverse country that it would be difficult to implement everything correctly. It would take a lot of effort and cooperation is something that we do not have much of in this country at this moment. Drug use is a huge issue in this country, with opiates killing thousands of people per year, so this is definitely an issue that we cannot ignore, and I think that if people are able to set aside their difference for this one issue, which I know is a long shot, we would be able to successfully implement decriminalization in the US and start making inroads into the drug problem.
All right, well, that about sums up our conversation on drugs. I think understanding examples from other countries are really interesting because I believe that some haven't worked. You believe that some have. I think also we always need to keep on check the idea that the addicts are the most important thing. We need to get them into recovery, and I think decriminalization is very effective on some of the problems with addicts going to recovery, and some not. Thank you so much for listening. Please comment down below what we should do next, what topic. We're always looking for topics, and give us any suggestions about our video because we would love to get some feedback. As always, thank you for listening and have a great day.